Good evening. In a previous video, which I'll link in the description below, I talked about the air terminal that once existed outside Waterloo Station. I also briefly talked about its replacement, the West London Air Terminal on Cromwell Road in Kensington. I received a comment on that video from David W. saying, "You talk about the BOAC terminal being in Cromwell Road, but I thought it was opposite Victoria Coach Station. Am I having a senior moment, or were there two of them?" No, David, you are absolutely correct. There were two of them. And while the one in Kensington was, shall we say, functional rather than cosmetic, the one in Victoria is definitely worthy of further discussion. This is what I like about you guys. You send my research into all sorts of crazy directions. This is the Imperial Airways Empire Terminal, and I think it's absolutely glorious. It was opened on the 5th of June 1939. Like the aforementioned terminals in Waterloo and Kensington, its function was to enable passengers to check in before being transported to the actual airport itself. It also housed the offices of Imperial Airways. Now, Imperial Airways was essentially Britain's first national airline, founded in 1924 from a merger of the Instone Airline Company, Marine Air Navigation, the Handley Page Transport Company, and the Daimler Airway. The need for a national airline like those in France and Germany was seen as both a matter of national pride and commercial necessity. As the name implied, it was an airline in the service of empire, designed to make travel between Britain and its colonies easier, and so make those colonies more commercially attractive, not to mention easier to administer. Imperial Airways and its associated companies could offer services to Australia, South Africa and India, with many stops along the way. It wasn't a very fast service by modern standards, and aircraft of the day were tiny compared to our modern airliners, but nevertheless passengers reported an enjoyable service if you could afford the relatively expensive tickets. Their London airport was at Croydon, although from 1937 they would also offer a flying boat service from Southampton to Cape Town. I love flying boats. I wish they were more commercially viable. Imperial Airways was killed not by commercial pressure, but by government legislation. For the Second World War, the Air Navigation Restriction in Time of War Act 1939 saw all airlines in Britain taken over by National Air Communications, a government department, from November of that year. A few months later, British Airways Limited and Imperial Airways were amalgamated into the British Overseas Airways Corporation, better known as BOAC. What that means is that Empire Terminal was only actually in the ownership of Imperial Airways for less than a year. Enough historical irony for now. Let's look at the building itself. Victoria was the railway terminus serving Croydon. The Air Ministry also insisted that the terminal be sited here in order to give access to Southampton. Waterloo would have been a better site for that, as later developments would prove, but at the time Victoria was the only major railway terminus serving the south of England that had enough space nearby. Empire Terminal offered a direct entrance to the station platforms, and the proximity of the coach station, opened in 1932, offered access to other airports in Britain. The terminal was designed by Albert Lakeman and built in Portland stone. On its opening it was described as the finest air terminal in the world, and I think, in aesthetic terms, it would still be a contender today. It's quite reminiscent of a bird in some ways, with its curved wings and the central clock tower forming the body. These extensions are later additions and, in my opinion, don't quite fit. It also bears this rather splendid sculpture by Eric R. Broadbent, which is entitled "Speed Wings Over the World," and, well, does exactly what it says on the tin. It depicts speed and wings over the world, representing the distance covered and the modernity that Imperial Airways wanted to convey. In 1974, BOAC would be merged with British European Airways to form the modern British Airways, not to be confused with British Airways Limited, which I briefly mentioned earlier. By this time, gone were the glamorous days of Pullman trains meeting flying boats. Now the emphasis was on efficiency and cost-effectiveness. Increased car ownership made travel by train or coach less attractive to air passengers. Heathrow Airport was firmly established and in 1977 had gained an underground connection. The Empire Terminal was now seen as unnecessary and closed in 1980. Fortunately, it was listed shortly afterwards. Now it's the headquarters of the National Audit Office, which is about as unromantic as it gets. Still, it remains as a monument to a different time. A time when world travel was still an adventure. I hope you enjoyed that video, and if so, please hit the like button and consider sharing. And I can't guarantee that subscribing and pressing the bell icon will bring back the romance of early air travel, but it couldn't hurt to try. I'll admit that the history of air travel isn't my area of expertise. Just the history of air travel, said the plain people of the comment section. But if you'd like to see more on London's air travel history, then do let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you very soon. Chocks away.